Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I welcome Dr. Ellie Gennings onto the show. Ellie, good to see you.
Hello, nice to see you.
Really excited to be talking with you about all things children's sports, well-being, well-becoming, which is a really interesting term that we haven't used on the Sports Psych Show before. So looking forward to unpacking a paper you've written with colleagues. But before we unpack that paper, tell us about yourself. Tell us about your work and tell us about you.
Okay, perfect. So I am based at Bournemouth University. I'm a senior lecturer in sport coaching. And really, a bit about me. I've always done sport. I absolutely love sport. At school, I was basically on every team, but hindered always by being the smallest person. Um, and I kind of decided from an early age that I wanted to be a PE teacher. I did an undergraduate degree in sport coaching at the University of Winchester, and learned a lot from Richard Cheetham, who you may or may not have had on the podcast.
No, but I know Richard.
Okay. And very quickly realised through doing lots of coaching work in schools that probably being a PE teacher wasn't for me. But I knew from the other coaching I did, so I did a lot of gymnastics coaching, that I loved coaching and I wanted to kind of keep working with children. Um, and part of my coaching philosophy has always been about centering young people, hearing their opinions, and really appreciating that they are way more creative than I ever could be as an adult. Um, and then decided very last minute to do a master's in sport and exercise science. Did lots more coaching. I took on lots of kind of research assistant roles. Did a little bit of work for my university's sports science clinic, working with athletes, and was just so happy doing sport, studying sport, coaching sport. Um, but the opportunity came up to do a PhD, which wasn't in sport, but encapsulated two things that I was really passionate about, which was children's well-being and children's voice. And so I applied to do this particular PhD and was fortunate enough to get it, and spent 3-4 years working outside of sports, looking at how do children conceptualize well-being, and actually how do we measure it. So my PhD is in health science, but I always knew that as soon as I was done with my PhD, I wanted to go straight back into sport and sport coaching, because I could see the direct links between what I was doing and how it would apply to sport. And that's when I ended up at Bournemouth University teaching here.
I love your eclectic background. Sports coaching degree and then masters in sports science and then PhD in well-being and children's health. I always think having an eclectic range of qualifications and experiences is so important. Just returning back to your experiences in sport, you said you coached gymnastics. Was that your? You mentioned being loving every sport and being involved in every
Yeah.
sport. Was gymnastics your primary sport? Would you say?
No, it wasn't actually.
Okay.
So I always played football and I always did athletics, and decided about the age of, I must have been 17, that I really wanted to put my everything into 400-meter sprinting, and spent sort of 3, maybe 4 years giving everything to that. But gymnastics is probably my favourite sport to coach, because it's, strength, flexibility, fundamental movement skills, sprinkling in a bit of creativity. And I just always really, really enjoyed it. And actually, one of my favourite coaching qualifications that I've ever done was fundamental movement skills. And I was able to, through gymnastics coaching, I also did a bit of athletics coaching too, was able to just enjoy that and coach those skills.
Do you? I don't want to go too off topic here, but it's really interesting. you're mentioning fundamental movement skills. I mean, your passion is for coaching. Would you suggest, or have you found that children engaging in a sport like gymnastics offers sort of it works as a kind of a donor sport for movement towards other sports? Would you suggest that engagement with gymnastics is a really useful sport to be involved with in order to promote movement skills in
Mhm.
other sports?
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest, yeah,
Succinctly
I've
done.
always thought that, but it's even like I said earlier, strength and flexibility,
Yeah.
and how those things are so important for so many other sports. But I do also feel like that about athletics because it's run, jump, throw, and that's transitions into lots of different sports.
Yeah. What happened to the running, the 400-meter running? How far did you get?
Well, honestly, just wasn't good enough. So I think I competed at a regional level. I represented the south of England,
Nice.
but I think I just realised that it just wasn't going to happen. And at the time, because I was doing lots of coaching, I just thought, okay, like it's time for me to hang up my spikes and just really focus on coaching because I was studying coaching. So I was like, I need to make sure that I'm actually doing it as well as, reading about it and studying it at university.
Just dwelling on that a second, because I'm kind of fascinated. Fascinated. I don't know why I'm fascinated. I suppose I do know why I'm fascinated in this, because this happened to me as a professional golfer. I realised I was playing with players who were just knocking it closer to the flag so many times more than I was, hitting it
Mhm.
so much further, striking the ball so much better that you're just like, yeah, I'm going to stand here 8 hours a day and I'm just not going to reach that level of ability. Was that kind of similar to your experience? You're looking around, you're looking at the times others are doing, you're looking at your rate of progress, and you're thinking, oh yeah, no, I'm just not going to get better.
Yeah, pretty much. And like I said, I'd started university, and I think I felt pressure to just make sure that I was um, gaining coaching experience. So I'm the first person in my family to go to university.
Okay.
So it's not pressure that people put on me, but I think it's pressure that I felt on myself to make sure that I've made this really big commitment to go to university and I want it to work for me.
Yeah.
And I think in my head, I thought my dream from a child was to be an Olympian. And I think I just realized that that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
And so instead of keep on trying to just put my efforts elsewhere, which was coaching. And I got so much joy from coaching at my local gymnastics club.
And just last question about some of your experiences here. You've coached a range of sports. Do you find experiences in one sport can lend themselves to other sports? Do you find that your experiences of you becoming a more experienced coach in one sport helps you become a better coach in another sport? Or is domain specific knowledge so crucially important that you can't improve your capacity to coach better without having real knowledge of these individual sports?
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's probably a balance of both,
Okay.
depending on the level of sport you're coaching. So for me, I was always coaching grassroots levels. I was never particularly interested in kind of performance coaching, but I felt with experience relatively confident that I could walk into a variety of settings and set problems or scenarios and work with young athletes on, okay, how could we do this differently or better? And I don't necessarily need to know everything about a sport in order to do that. But I think that takes time and experience and confidence.
We're here today to unpack this paper, which is entitled A Critical Examination of Children's Wellbeing and Well-Becoming in a Professional Youth Football Academy. And you are the lead author in this research paper, alongside you've got a star team, Emma Kavanagh, Alice Hunter, and Ian Jones. I'd like to dig a little deeper into the history of this paper, I'm assuming it's a little bit related to, at least historically, your PhD. But can you sort of give us an idea of the genesis of this paper, where it comes from, and your interest in this area?
Yeah, okay. So where to begin? So we first, before we had the idea of looking at this data set through the well-being, well-becoming lens, we, as colleagues, because we all work at Bournemouth University, were just having a general conversation in the corridor about the documentary that had just been broadcast on Channel 4. And I sort of immediately said, I can't watch it because it'll probably just make me angry.
Which documentary is that, just for everybody
And
listening in?
sorry, yeah. So it's a documentary that follows the lives of young male footballers going through a professional football academy. And each episode is focused on a different age group, and it follows the boys right from the start of the season through to the contract decision. And one of my other colleagues had watched it, and just sort of said, yeah, it's kind of what I expected to see. And Dr. Alice Hunter said, well, why don't we use that as a data set? Why don't we look at it through a critical lens? And I thought, okay, like I could get on board with that. And at the time, I was in the middle of trying to publish a scale development paper, not in the context of sport, not probably the most exciting paper. But I was reading lots around general measurement of children's well-being, kind of how we conceptualize children's well-being. And I came across a paper by Professor Benaria that talked about the distinction between well-being and well-becoming for children. And he'd written about the fact that children are in a unique position in life because they are going to become an adult. And so we need to think about how do we support well-being through that sense, but also children right here, right now, are beings in the present, they're active citizens, they have rights. And so I was reading that paper at the time for my lovely scale development paper. And I was thinking, oh, it would be really interesting actually to apply this lens to that documentary series to see, how is the Football Academy portrayed in media to the public, with the assumption that probably we would find an overemphasis on developing children's future potential. And that's how the paper was born.
Love to get some definitions in place here, whether that's defining well-being through, in general terms. Is there a specific definition for well-being with relation to children, and then well-becoming? Love it. Tell us all about that. Define that for us. What do you mean by that? So,
Yeah.
yeah, a couple of questions there.
Okay. So in the paper, we use some of my PhD published research to define children's well-being. Because the first paper that I published was after a project where I'd worked with groups of young people around how do they conceptualize well-being. And we were really interested in differences between how adult experts conceptualize young people's well-being and actually how do they themselves. And so that definition's in the paper. And it talks really broadly around how external influences on children's life, in addition to positive feelings they have, how does that to them contribute to this sense of well-being? But in this particular paper, I mean well-being in the broadest of senses. To conceptualize well-being in academic literature is really muddy,
Okay.
and we could be thinking about it from do you have a sense of purpose to have you got meaningful relationships in your life, physical health, social health, spirituality. And in the paper we just mean it in the broadest sense. So how can we support a child's overall sense of well-being, with the distinction, and it's almost a play on words, but if you think about children and childhood, and in the paper we talk about a misconception of childhood, which we can touch on later. But the idea is that children are becoming, and so we need to think about broadly their well-being. How do we support what they're becoming? Because that is an important part of their life, in addition to their well-being, their being in the present. And we just thought that that kind of play on words, that distinction between those two different things might be helpful for practitioners to use to reflect on their own practice, to identify gaps in what they're doing, essentially.
Well, you mentioned this word misconception, and with relation to misconception of childhood in sport, you've helped us understand well-being and well-becoming with relation to childhood. Could you tell us a little bit about the misconception of childhood in sport? Because I know you provide a little bit of a literature review here within your paper when people dive into this paper. So, yeah, take us through this a little bit.
Yeah, okay. So our kind of mindset around the function of childhood or the value of childhood will impact ultimately the decisions that we make in the organisation of sport and the delivery of youth sports. And there's some really, really lovely work done by Dr. Patrick Tomlin. And in this particular paper, he talks about different metaphors for childhood. So one of the metaphors that he talks about is this kind of sapling perspective of childhood, and the idea that we might view children or childhood as kind of smaller, weedier versions of trees or adults. But importantly, if that's how we view children as kind of smaller miniature adults that are dependent on us to help them grow, to support them, to nourish them in whatever context, whatever that might look like, we position children as kind of passive members of society. And I think maybe more traditionally, that's how we might see children being viewed certainly in a high performance sporting context. But in this work, they also propose the idea that we could see children through a caterpillar lens. And so, since caterpillars ultimately become butterflies, they are two unique, distinct things or beings that have different values, different goods, and in their own right, they're kind of worthy, if you like. And we could say that that's the distinction between childhood and adulthood, is that they're just different things. They have different meaning, they have different values, they have different goods. And there's lots of literature in childhood studies actually that talks about the unique goods of childhood. And so it is a phase in life that we should recognise, respect, and protect. And so that could be things like children are more likely to engage in free play. And this is in a general sense, might have less significant responsibility than adults do, have considerable free time. And one which I think is really interesting is around the relationships that children have with each other. So as an adult, I can't have the same relationship with a child as I would have done if I was a child. And so there are particular things about childhood that are unique and should be protected. And depending on whether we view children through this kind of sapling lens as miniature adults they're going to develop, or if we view it through this kind of caterpillar lens that they are unique beings, that will significantly impact how we treat them, how we advocate for them, how we go about organising sport.
Children aren't mini adults.
Yes, that's one of I suppose, the kind of fundamental arguments in the paper. And this isn't necessarily something that you might reflect on, but hopefully with this paper, it might just mean that practitioners get the opportunity or a moment to think about, well, what do I think childhood is? What do I value about children and childhood? And how can that inform or influence my practice?
And I suppose listening to what you're saying, it's making me think of perhaps what might be considered a typical socio-cultural narrative around sport and children's involvement in sport is perhaps that traditional lens has seen children as recipients rather than
Mhm.
participants.
Yeah. Yeah, so in the paper, I think we make the point that I suppose it's about reflecting on, are children for sport or is sport for children? And if we are centering children's well-being, then sport is for children, and I believe that sport is a brilliant place in order for us to support children's well-being, in order for us to realise their rights, to be a rights respecting space. I think importantly, in high performance sport, there is that tension that it isn't about, I suppose, well-being and flourishing. It is about results. But I would say if you are working with children, you have a responsibility, a duty of care like any other sector would do, that works with children for children.
Yeah, and I don't want to jump ahead here because we're going to unpack your themes from observation of this documentary. But I think that attitudes are shifting in terms of you've suggested a continuum there of on one end being the seriousness of elite development sport. I don't like using that word elite, but let's just go with that. And then on the other end, perhaps flourishing and thriving as a child. And I just wonder if they sit on two different continuums and we can have both at the same time, that they don't work on polar opposites here, that they can be
Mhm.
enjoyed at the same time, that a safe and healthy
Yeah.
environment for children, especially in talent development pathways that are perhaps created by organisations that are well known. For example, Premier League clubs in men's soccer,
Mhm.
football. That
Yeah.
it's possible to create pathways that offer children the experience of both, helping them be involved in that process, but offer them both the opportunity to experience safe involvement in sport, but also healthy involvement that allows them to be the very best that they can be in that safe manner.
Yeah, and I don't think it's one or the other. That's not what I want
Yeah.
to say or to suggest, because I believe that you can have both, you can do both. But I also don't think it's kind of binary in a sense that, if you're an elite performer, you're either flourishing or you're not. It's kind of much more complex than that. And if we talk about flourishing, that could be in so many different contexts. You might be overall flourishing, you might be flourishing as a performer, but not in other areas of your life. And so I think using these terms, you have to be really deliberate and have to be really mindful that it's conceptually difficult and complex. But I absolutely believe that you can be a high level performer in your sport, in a safe sporting environment.
Well, welfare, well-being, mental health, performance,
Mhm.
development, growth, maturation,
Mhm.
or flourishing. All of these are, as you've mentioned, that word complex
Mhm.
and multidimensionally underpinned, experienced in multidimensional ways, and often individual specific as well.
Yeah.
So as you say, I suppose what sums it up is that word complex and complexity.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And this paper is in the context of the UK. Obviously, I'm UK based as well. So when we're talking about these things, it is our kind of white Western conceptualization of well-being. And actually, if you dig into some of that literature, there's a really interesting book. I can't remember who it's written by, but it's a lexicon of happiness, and it talks about, from multiple different cultures, that happiness means so many different things, and there's so many different ways to articulate it. that there really is kind of cultural nuance in all of these things.
Cross-cultural differences, absolutely, adding to the adding to the complexity. But that's why we love this topic, right? That's why we love it.
Exactly.
It's so interesting.
Mhm.
Hey, let's unpack your findings. So, tell us a little bit about the method here. What did you actually do? So, you've got this documentary, and
Mhm.
you're enveloping your viewing of this documentary with
Mhm.
through a lens of well-being and well-becoming, children's experience in sport.
Mhm.
So, yeah, take us through the methodology here.
Yep. Okay. So we were really mindful that this isn't necessarily a typical data set, and we tried in the paper to make that obvious. We are very aware of the limitations of looking at something like a documentary, and so in our in our approach to analysing the data, we wanted to be as rigorous as we could. So the data was actually analysed by both myself and by Dr. Alice Hunter, and we did that independently from each other, which was a really interesting experience. So we thematically analysed the data, and we sat down together and just went through like what are the themes you have, what did you find, um, and they were slightly different, but they mapped together really well. And what that meant to us is that we're kind of minimising our own bias with this analysis because we've done it independently and we've come up with similar things. And then it was about mapping it to well-being, well-becoming. What are we actually seeing? Which is where we ended up with three overall themes that talk to the well-being, well-becoming lens.
Let's go through these themes. Let's unpack these themes. So, the first theme, and I'll throw you um, each section,
Okay.
each theme, and then you can throw me back some thoughts. So, theme one was well becoming as an integral part of the academy structure. Yes, talk us through this.
Um, so this first theme really dives into kind of the business oriented nature of the academy. So kind of looking at young footballers as part of a system and not necessarily as children. Um, and this is one of the places actually in the paper that we try to be really deliberate with our language. And when we are talking about the boys in the academy, we're referring to them as children and not athletes. And that's kind of a deliberate way of kind of recognizing that these are people. They are not just athletes, part of a system. And I think in this first scene, we talk about kind of how pervasive that the nature of the academy is in its focus on what do children become, to the point where one of or a couple of the quotes that we've included are, I think they're from parents, that kind of talk about how we are seeing children as marketable products and how that language and that view of their child shifts and changes because of the structure of the academy, how there is an overemphasis on what a child becomes.
Well, I'd like to read out one of the quotes taken from the show and from a mother of an under 14s player here. I mean, this mother says, it's not a personality contest, it's a business, and the academy need to decide whether they're going to invest more money and time on your child. So that's what it boils down to at the end of the day.
Mm.
I need to find somebody who is good at marketing
Yeah.
because it is about a sales pitch. It is about selling the individual. I know that sounds awful.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm talking about him like a product, but that's what he's going to be,
Mhm.
which is really sad, but that is what he's going to be.
Yeah.
No, yeah, no questions, but what does that evoke in you?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, um, it was really sad to kind of see and read. And what we didn't want to do in this paper was to kind of place blame on parents, or to be honest, even coaches, because I don't
No.
think that that's the right place to kind of place blame on the individual people, because I think what parents do in these football academies, the way in which they support their children, is impacted by the environment. It's impacted by what they see as normal. And I think the production of this documentary is another way of reinforcing that this is what to expect if this happens to your child and your family. That this is the way in which children are talked about, and I do recognise as well that that parent might have been asked a leading question. That might have been a really nicely edited clip in the documentary, but that's still what made it into the documentary. After all of that editing process, that's still the picture of the academy that has been wanted to be portrayed. And so we don't really in the paper comment too much about the production of the documentary and the kind of wider impact of that. But I do think that that's almost a strength to analysing this type of data, is that the impact that this data set has goes beyond just what we're saying in our study, and it's broadcast to the nation. It's hopefully something that people can connect with, because they might have watched the documentary and I don't know, maybe they come across this podcast or the paper itself and really connect with, oh, I watched that, but never even thought about it in this light. And so when we think about having impact, I'm kind of hoping that by looking at the documentary, it helps people connect with what we're trying to say, the message that we're trying to put across.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, I mean, I watched the documentary and I've read your paper, and I'd be at pains to say that any kind of individual blame is absolutely not where you're coming from, and you and your fellow authors, and for me and all my experience, I've had the joy of being able to work with many academies across all sports, and the reality is so many of these behaviours and so many choices are made as a consequence of what you could say are the stuck socio-cultural narratives within these environments, the social norms. Nobody's necessarily going in there and saying we have to do it this way. They just seem to linger. And it's also important to recognize that so many of these approaches, opinions, and viewpoints stem from parental love and care for their child, because a child says, I love soccer, I love football, I want to be really good at it. The coaches care. The coaches care about the people that they are helping in these environments. So it's such a really interesting dynamic where there's so much great stuff, so much positive stuff, but these mini stuck socio-cultural narratives and social norms where you look at it and you go, oh, wow, oh, that I'm not too sure if I'm comfortable with that. It's not blaming anybody, but it's going, is this how we really want to do this here? Is this optimal? Is this a great way for children to be treated?
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with the point that you've just made. And I think this probably nicely segues into the next theme from the paper. But I think you as a parent, or as a parent, sorry, you've definitely got pressure on you to conform to these norms, but you've also got the knowledge that there's probably however many other boys waiting to get into that academy. So if you don't kind of conform to what's being asked of you, then that's potentially it for your child's dream to be a footballer. So it's really problematic.
Well, let's use that segue. Let's go on to the second theme, a normalized. It's entitled "Normalized Focus on Well Becoming." Unpack this for us a little bit.
So the pressures, I think, that we've just talked about, that parents have, come from this normalization that everyone wants to be in the academy. Any parent would want this, and this buy into this narrative that everyone everywhere wants their child to be a successful footballer. Why wouldn't you want that? And it's something that was really interesting to look at in the data. We tried to highlight it with the quotes that we had, and this idea that people are talking about everyone wants this. And I think, that's problematic, because it means that if you're in the system, then you're lucky to be in the system because it's what everyone wants. And to build on that, we talk in the paper about it becoming incredibly normalized to have a sole focus on what we call well becoming. And we've got some quotes from the young footballers that talk about things that they've given up, the idea that they don't have a plan B and that they're going to give everything that they've got in order to try and achieve their goal of a contract of becoming a professional footballer. And to link back to some of the childhood goods that I talked about earlier in this episode, by sacrificing things like going on holiday, like spending time with friends and family, you are sacrificing, I would argue, some of your childhood goods that you can't really retain as an adult. And that is such a huge sacrifice to kind of consent to or to understand as a child. But equally, one of the kind of key things about childhood that we, in some of my original work in the general field of well-being, and in some of my current work at the moment around safe sport, is that we see that children have a huge reliance on friends, on peers, for a sense of belonging, to feel a sense of safety. And within these environments, because they're so focused on becoming a footballer, they also don't establish things like meaningful relationships with peers. Because while you might have friends in the academy, you are ultimately competing for the same contracts. And this kind of normalized focus on becoming a professional footballer at the sacrifice of so many other things that make childhood good is really problematic.
I'd love to read out some of the quotes again here
Mhm,
because I just think it's so relevant, and as I'm blessed to work predominantly at the adult elite level, so the professional level, and
mhm,
I know how challenging it is to reach that stage, and so many factors that are out of your control influence whether you reach that stage. So to
mhm,
listen to or to read narratives like this, do feel a little bit disconcerting. So from an
mhm.
under 11s player, we don't go on holidays. We just work hard. We have football fitness, football fitness, football fitness every single week. My dad sacrificed everything for me. Um, there's a lot in there. An under 16s
Yeah.
player, I don't think about plan B because my dream is to become a professional footballer. I want that scholarship so much. Like, that will just be my joy if I can get that scholarship. Placing a lot of
Mhm.
pressure on yourself there. And then an under
Yeah.
14s player, my dream is to become a pro footballer and I want to score a winner for England in the World Cup. I could picture like England versus France at the 90th minute. I get the ball, dribble past everyone and score. I've got very high expectations because if I'm not a footballer, I don't know what I'm gonna be. Again, I suppose
Mhm.
that last sentence there in that quote that is concerning. Picturing scoring a
Mhm.
winning goal in the World Cup final, I think, is what every kid is going to do. But
Yeah, and we're not
exactly,
saying that like that type of dream is not
yes,
okay. It's the lens again. So you could say, okay, they have a hyper focus on well
yes,
becoming, but what about the
yes.
being? What are we doing to support that child right here, right now, in addition to helping them achieve what they want to do in life?
Absolutely. Um, our final theme: exploitation of ambition placed undue pressure on the being, which I think
Yeah.
you were kind of speaking to there. Unpack this a little bit for me.
Yeah. So we what a very clear theme within the documentary, and I don't think this will be a surprise to people listening, was the idea that all you need to do to be successful is try hard, keep going, and be determined. And For me, I think I find that narrative quite frustrating because we know that there are so many different things that will impact that contract decision. Um, and yes, having a good attitude is a good thing to have, but that isn't ultimately the reason you get a contract or not. And that's problematic because this is where we've tried to sort of argue in the paper that this places pressure on the child in the present, the kind of well-being of that young athlete, that young footballer, because they're the one that needs to try hard right here, right now. And if they don't get their contract, or they don't think they succeed, the blame is on them because it's all about trying hard. So if I didn't get that contract at the end of the season, it's because I didn't try. And what that means is that it kind of absolves the system of responsibility over why that decision has been made. Um, so we wanted to kind of pick up on that narrative and say that actually it's not fair, it's not reflective of reality. And when we think about how we're supporting children, I don't think that encouraging them to solely focus on just trying hard is beneficial for them when things do go wrong.
I completely agree, and this is it was really interesting for me that this was a part of your findings, your unpacking of watching the documentary, because I actually wrote a few pieces online on social media myself, having watched the documentary, which I enjoyed and respected. Very, very good people striving to do really good work in an academy setting, which is enormously demanding, with key stakeholders demanding certain things. And as I've said earlier, these socio-cultural narratives and these social norms running through this academy. And my overriding thought about it all was this constant language of work hard, work hard, work hard. And to speak to your point here, your unpacking of this is, if I work hard and I'm determined, then I'll get there. And again, talking about social norms and socio-cultural narratives, and things through a Western lens. If I work hard, I'll get there, which, feels optimistic and is kind of understandable and feels like the right thing to broadcast. But actually, I was left very frustrated because I just thought, and again, we're only seeing a snapshot here because I'm sure there's great work going on behind the scenes that is broadening what young people and parents need to understand about engagement in academy sport. But it was like, no, there's so many other things here. And just looking at developing in your sport, engaging and developing and competing in your sport as a child through the lens of, if I just work hard, then I will get there, is actually, for me, does more harm than good, because it's an overly simplistic lens. And actually, when we unpack the complexity, and without sounding like a raving psychologist and starting to talk about things like metacognition, thinking about thinking about behaviors, thinking about deliberate practice and deliberate play, and and unpacking how young people learn games effectively, what's within your locus of control, what's within your control, what's not within your control. All of these things are thrown into the mix and are so relevant. And actually, when an environment takes that quite studious approach, it also helps these young people grow as people, because they're involved in metacognition, meta behaviors. They're engaged in self-awareness and self-reflection and all these kind of really important personal skills that are going to help them as people as well. So that the unpacking of development in such a simple form means that they don't get that rich experience of looking at things in a more complex way that helps them develop as people. I hope that ramble made sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and again, I completely agree with you. So yeah.
Okay, all right. So those were the three themes. And so sort of moving on to your conclusions here and any kind of recommendations that the paper had. I mean, can you take us through this, please?
Yeah. So we wanted to make recommendations for practice. Or I think we call them points for
Okay,
reflection.
sorry.
No, it's fine. Because I think for us, we've kind of pitched this idea about um, reflecting on practice through this slightly different lens to highlight areas that you maybe do really well in, but also areas that you can improve on. But ultimately, we wanted to make some form of suggestion instead of just saying this looks bad. And potentially on the surface level, some of our recommendations probably seem quite radical, but actually, as a group of researchers, we're really confident in them, and we're not expecting them all to happen suddenly overnight. We're realistic, and this is why we've pitched them as points for reflection. But all of them are evidence based. We haven't talked about children's rights yet, but few of them link to the children's rights movement. And actually, the hope of the paper was that the way in which we've presented the evidence and the lens, we've kind of shown that the current system is radical when you consider children's human rights, children's well-being, and actually the suggestions that we are making are sound evidence-based suggestions.
What are those suggestions? And you've mentioned children's rights, and remiss of me not to bring this topic in earlier. So my apologies there. And anything you want to add to that with relation to unpacking your recommendations. So do speak to children's rights and with relation to recommendations.
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, this links back to some of our original discussions around the misconception of childhood and what the value of childhood is. And if we go back to all the way back to the kind of caterpillar metaphor of childhood, when we say that they are beings in the present, they do contribute to society, they're active citizens, that directly relates to them being rights holders. So having developmental protection and participation rights in society. And importantly, the rights they have are non-negotiable. It's not a gift that we give them; they have them, and it's our duty to respect and uphold them. So, in relation to children's rights, I'll talk about the second and the third recommendation first, because these all kind of centre around participation rights and the idea that children have the right to have a say in matters that affect them. And so, one of our recommendations in the paper is that academy structures, safeguarding policy and procedures should be co created with the children that are part of the academy. And that's all about hearing their voice and their perspective. And I also think, knowing colleagues from different institutions and the work that they're currently doing, that some of this is ongoing, and I'm really excited for it to be shared wider. But the importance of youth voice in decisions like this. So a project that I'm working on at the moment, that's funded by the IOC, is all about how do young people understand and feel safe in high performance sports. And part of what we're doing is looking at, well, what do young athletes say compared to adults? Adults who work in this space, so coaches, welfare officers, parents. And like one of the key differences that we've seen is that as adults, we talk a lot about safeguarding procedures. So for our athletes to feel safe, we need to make sure that there's robust sign in and sign out procedures, that the website's up to date with our kind of safeguarding policy. But for athletes, they've talked to me a lot about relationships and how they're really important for them to feel safe. Most importantly, is their relationships with their teammates, with their peers. And so there's like this real difference between, well, what do young people think about this issue and what do we as adults think about this issue? And it's not that one's right and one's wrong. It's just that they've got equal value and we need to consider both. So when we're thinking about, well, what do football academies look like? How can we best support children? In the paper, we argue that children need to be included in this in the right way. We need to ask the right questions. We need to provide the right space for them to answer. It's not enough to just survey young people on their experience of these academies. It's really, again, complex. It's nuanced, and that's something that we would like people to consider. And the third recommendation, which is kind of interlinked, talks about embedding children into the organisation and the governance of sport. So this isn't written in the paper, but in my head, I'm thinking, where is the Greta Thunberg of sport? We need a child-led voice in this space to demand, to say, this is what we want, this is what we need from these sporting environments. So that's the second and third recommendation. So the first recommendation we make in the paper talks about where commitment lies, essentially. And so at the moment, a child will sign a contract to a football academy, and they are committed to that academy. And one point that we've suggested for consideration is, well, can't football academies commit to a child, sign a contract to say that until you are 18 or 19 years old, you will be part of our academy, and we will therefore develop you. And the child has the autonomy to leave that academy at any point. If they don't think it's working, if they don't think they're developing, they can leave. And the idea of that is that it would hopefully drive development in this space, because actually, if you want to keep players, you need to ensure that you are developing them holistically. And so, yeah, that was one of our recommendations: is could this work? Like, we don't know. We're not saying it would work and it's the perfect solution, but it's certainly something to think about.
I love it. I love it. I love those ideas, and they're sense making in a complex arena. So I think sparking really interesting conversation there. What's next here? It sounds like you've got a few projects on the go. Where's this leading to? I think you've mentioned a couple of things,
Yeah,
but where's this
so
leading to?
so I mean, I would like to say that, for anyone listening, I'm open to talking, to chatting about this. I think, to keep the conversation moving forward, that's really important. But my work at the moment is focused more broadly on sport than specifically at football, and looking at how do we include youth voice in sporting spaces, and kind of drawing on some of my background experience outside of sport, and looking to fields like education and childhood studies to use research methods that genuinely include the voice of children, and thinking about, okay, how can we improve sport to make children feel safe so that they can flourish, so that they can perform better. And in some of that work at the moment, what's really, really lovely is that the conversations that I've had with high performance athletes is that they are tying a sense of safety, feeling safe in their sport, to performing better, which is wonderful. It's what we want to hear, and I'm really excited, in the coming months, to start sharing some of that work and to really, really shout about that and champion what young athletes are saying about this.
I love it. I love it. Ellie, such a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate your time today. And as you mentioned there, you're open to having more conversations on this with anybody who's interested. So, how can people potentially find you, follow you, and get in touch?
LinkedIn is the way. So Ellie Jennings, it is Jennings spelled with a G, not a J. Or email. You can find my staff profile on the Bournemouth University page, which has got my contact email in there. But thank you to you as well, Dan. It's been a really nice conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ellie Jennings. Thank you. Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.